They called him the upright man, a soldier, a president, a revolutionary who refused everything the powerful offered. But the very day he tried to change Africa forever, forces he couldn't see were already moving to stop him. Follow Hidden Tales so these stories never disappear again. Thomas Sankara did not begin life as a symbol. He was born in Yako, a small town in Upper Volta, where dust rose from the earth like smoke and opportunities were few. His parents were modest people. His father a government clerk, his mother a devout Catholic who taught him that dignity was not a privilege, but a responsibility. From childhood, he walked with the quiet certainty of someone who believed he had a purpose, even before he knew what that purpose was. He was brilliant, observant, and strangely disciplined for a boy so young. Teachers noticed it. Neighbors noticed it. Sankara had a way of listening more deeply than others, as though he were storing the world in his mind. He read everything he could find: history, philosophy, military strategy, the liberation speeches of African icons. By adolescence, he was already forming opinions about freedom, justice, and the shape Africa could take if its people rose beyond the limitations imposed on them. But the world around him did not yet match his ideals. Upper Volta was one of the poorest nations on earth, its politics shaped by French influence, its leaders often more loyal to Paris than to their own citizens. Corruption was normal. Dependency was expected. Young men were taught to accept authority, not challenge it. Sankara did not accept that. At 17, he entered a military academy, ironically, the institution that would shape him into the revolutionary the government would eventually fear. Some expected the military to tame him. Instead, it sharpened him. He excelled in tactics, strategy, and leadership, but it was his empathy that set him apart. He didn't bark orders. He inspired. It was here that he met two men who would shape, and eventually end, his story: Blaise Compaoré, who became his closest friend, and the network of French advisors who monitored promising young soldiers quietly, carefully, patiently. They took note of Sankara's intellect. They took note of his charisma. And they worried. Sankara climbed the ranks quickly. Wherever he was posted, whether managing supplies or commanding troops, he became known for integrity that bordered on stubbornness. He refused bribes. He refused privilege. He refused to treat lower-ranking soldiers like servants. In a system built on hierarchy and domination, that made him dangerous. By the early 1980s, Upper Volta was spiraling. The people were starving. The government was deep in debt. Politicians enriched themselves while peasants suffered. International financial institutions demanded structural adjustments, which was a polite way of demanding suffering in exchange for loans. Sankara saw it clearly. The country was independent only in name. His voice grew louder. He criticized the government openly. He spoke about imperialism in front of foreign diplomats. He condemned corruption in front of the politicians committing it. And the people began to whisper his name, not as a soldier but as a leader. In 1983, Sankara was appointed prime minister. It should have been a victory. Instead, it was the moment that put him directly in the crosshairs of France. Sankara met with global leaders who expected him to play by the rules. Instead, he spoke of African self-reliance, economic independence, and the end of neocolonialism. He spoke truth to power with a smile that made his honesty even more threatening. Foreign officials complained. Internal elites panicked. And only weeks later, Sankara was arrested. They locked him away in a dim, hot room. No trial. No explanation. Only silence. But the people did not stay silent. Protests erupted in the streets. Young soldiers defected. Civilians marched on government buildings. And Blaise Compaoré, Sankara's trusted friend, led a military uprising demanding Sankara's release. The government caved. When Sankara walked out of captivity, the air around him felt different. He was no longer merely a soldier or a minister. He was the embodiment of a movement. Weeks later, the revolution took shape. A coup, bloodless, swift, and wildly popular, swept Sankara into power. But this was not like the coups Africa had seen before. The moment he assumed leadership, he did something almost unthinkable. He refused luxury. He refused wealth. He refused the very privileges every leader before him had embraced. And the people felt something they had not felt in decades: hope. He renamed the country. Upper Volta became Burkina Faso, the land of upright people. A new identity, a new direction, a new destiny. But even in these early days of transformation, the enemies of Sankara's vision were already watching. And they were preparing. Because the world had never seen a leader like him. And those who profited from Africa's weakness feared what would happen if he succeeded. More than anything, they feared his ideas. Because Sankara, unlike any leader they had ever faced, spoke as if he truly believed Africa did not need saving. Africa needed awakening. And that belief would cost him everything. When Thomas Sankara assumed power in 1983, the country he inherited was exhausted. The fields were dry. The treasury was empty. Foreign donors spoke to Burkina Faso as if it were a child incapable of feeding itself. Many leaders before him had responded by begging for aid, offering loyalty in exchange for loans, or quietly enriching themselves before collapse became unavoidable. Sankara did the opposite. His first directive was simple and radical: Burkina Faso must feed itself. Not someday. Not gradually. No. He rejected the idea that hunger was inevitable or that salvation would come from abroad. Instead of forcing farmers into submission, he empowered them. New agricultural techniques were introduced. Community granaries were built. Fertilizer prices were reduced. Farmers were given control over their own land and harvests. Within 4 years, food production nearly doubled. Villages that once waited for foreign grain now overflowed with their own crops. For the people, the change was not abstract. It was physical. They saw their president kneeling in the soil beside them, hands dirty, sleeves rolled up, speaking not as a ruler but as an equal. When Sankara traveled through the countryside, he refused parades. He refused banquets. He ate what villagers ate. He slept where soldiers slept. He insisted that leadership meant sacrifice before command. And the people believed him. Sankara sold the government's fleet of luxury Mercedes and replaced them with modest vehicles. He cut ministerial salaries, including his own. He banned first-class travel. He outlawed excessive allowances. The invisible wall between leaders and citizens began to collapse. But with every privilege stripped away, resentment grew. Corrupt officials lost their benefits overnight. Middlemen who had grown rich from exploitation watched their networks disintegrate. Foreign companies accustomed to easy deals now faced regulations enforced by a leader who could not be bought. And Sankara pushed further. He launched one of the most ambitious vaccination campaigns Africa had ever seen. In a matter of weeks, millions of children were immunized against measles, meningitis, and yellow fever. Global health organizations were stunned. A country once dismissed as helpless had accomplished what wealthier nations struggled to achieve. Railways were built. Schools rose from dry earth. Hospitals opened their doors. But they were not constructed by foreign contractors. They were built by Burkinabe hands. Each structure carried a message: we are capable. Then Sankara touched the deepest nerve of all. He challenged patriarchy. He outlawed forced marriages. He condemned polygamy. He criminalized female genital mutilation. He placed women in positions of power and encouraged them to serve in the military. He said openly what many feared to hear: a nation cannot rise while half its people are held down. Applause followed. So did hatred. Foreign governments watched closely. Their influence in West Africa had always depended on compliant leaders, and Sankara refused compliance. He criticized the World Bank. He rejected IMF loans. He spoke of debt not as assistance but as a weapon. Then came the speech that changed everything. In Addis Ababa, before African heads of state, Sankara stood alone and said what none of them dared. He warned that Africa's debt was a new form of slavery. He urged leaders to refuse repayment unless former colonial powers repaid what they had stolen. The room fell silent. The applause was hesitant. And Sankara understood something chilling. He was alone. By crossing that invisible line, he became more than a reformer, he became a threat. Intelligence agencies began tracking him. Foreign envoys arrived with smiles that carried warnings. Business leaders spoke of instability, a word used when profits are endangered. Inside Burkina Faso, another danger was forming. The soldiers and ministers who once stood beside him began to feel overshadowed. Sankara's discipline made their compromises impossible. His popularity made them irrelevant. His integrity exposed their weaknesses. No one felt this more sharply than Blaise Compaoré. Once inseparable, the two men now diverged. Sankara rejected all foreign influence. Compaoré believed alliances were necessary. Sankara demanded discipline from the military. Compaoré cultivated loyalty within it. Whispers moved through the barracks. Foreign diplomats visited Compaoré more often. Meetings took place behind closed doors. Something was shifting. Sankara felt it. He sensed the unease, the distance where trust once lived. But he refused to slow down. He refused to soften his message. He believed that truth mattered more than power, and that the revolution would outlive him. What he did not know was that the people he trusted most were already choosing sides. And some had decided that Sankara, with all his integrity and vision, had become too dangerous to keep alive. The collision was no longer avoidable. It was approaching. He had changed a country. He had given a nation a new name, Burkina Faso. He had planted forests where there was desert, built schools where ignorance once ruled, and ignited hope where despair had hardened for generations. But every revolution creates enemies, and every dream carries the weight of those it threatens. As the years passed, the world's attention shifted. No longer curious, no longer amused. Concern replaced admiration. Those who profited from Africa's dependence, those who thrived on quiet exploitation and obedient leaders, began to whisper behind closed doors. Sankara's refusal to borrow, to bow, to bargain had destabilized something far larger than Burkina Faso. It had exposed a system. At home, the impact of his reforms was undeniable. Food scarcity declined. Children survived diseases that once swept through villages unchecked. Women spoke where silence had been enforced. The poor stood taller. But the old elite felt the ground move beneath them. Landowners resented redistribution. Bureaucrats resented accountability. Profiteers resented transparency. What Sankara called justice they called chaos. Abroad, embassies began sending quiet warnings. One country resisting dependency could inspire others. One leader refusing control could ignite a continent. Multinational corporations watched contracts dissolve. Trade partners slowed cooperation. Financial institutions tightened pressure. Inside the government, fractures widened. Generals once loyal began to hesitate. Ministers who praised Sankara in public avoided him in private. His ideals had become inconvenient. His discipline unbearable. And at the center of it all stood Blaise Compaoré. They had once shared rifles and dreams. Together they overthrew the old regime. Together they promised a new Africa. But while Sankara hardened his stance against foreign influence, Compaoré softened toward it. Foreign envoys offered him alliances, quiet meetings, veiled promises, protection. They offered what Sankara refused: wealth, status, comfort. Sankara felt the shift long before it was spoken. On late nights, he sat alone on the porch of the presidential residence, listening to distant drums and distant conversations. Eyes that once met his with trust now carried calculation. He tried to speak to them, to remind them of the oath, to restore unity. But every conversation ended the same way: silence, eyes turned away, hands clenched. Loyalty was no longer ideological. It was transactional. By mid-1987, pressure tightened from every direction. Economic independence brought retaliation. Trade slowed. Aid vanished. Internally, shortages returned, not from failure but from isolation. Opposition voices, subtle and strategic, began undermining reforms. Traditional chiefs challenged land policies. Every success had become a target. Sankara knew it. So did his enemies. On a humid night in July, he called a private meeting. Only a handful of trusted ministers attended. Lantern light flickered across tired faces as Sankara spoke plainly about foreign interference, internal corruption, and betrayal creeping into the army. This revolution, he said quietly, is no longer under attack only from outside. It is bleeding from within. Hands met hands. Promises were made. Loyalty was sworn. But within those handshakes, decisions had already been made elsewhere. After that night, Compaoré's visits to embassies increased. Conversations shifted into foreign languages. Documents were signed. The old elite found refuge in shadows. Sankara felt time slipping, not for his life but for the dream. He accelerated reforms. More land redistributed. More trees planted. More speeches broadcast across Africa. Each speech raised hope. Each decree unsettled power. His voice echoed beyond borders, warning that Africa's independence would never be given. It would have to be taken. They believed they could break him slowly. Starve the people's faith. Wait for exhaustion. They were wrong. Sankara refused to bargain. He refused to retreat. Silence no longer served the revolution. And his voice, unyielding and fearless, continued to rise. Even as the final trap was being set, Burkina Faso woke each morning to the sound of change. Roads stretched where there had once been dust. Schools rose from dry earth. Communities long ignored were finally seen. But beneath the rhythm of progress, something darker was moving. Quiet, patient, close. Thomas Sankara had enemies, but he did not realize how near they were, or how far they were willing to go. Inside the army barracks, loyalty gave way to fear. Officers who once praised Sankara's discipline now whispered that he was pushing the nation too fast. They spoke of sanctions, shortages, and neighboring governments uneasy with Burkina Faso's example. And at the center of those whispers stood the man who once called him brother. Blaise Compaoré had become the bridge between foreign powers and internal dissent. Diplomats who failed to influence Sankara found a receptive ear in Blaise. Meetings multiplied, dim rooms, hushed tones, coded language. The deals promised stability, but stability came with a price. Foreign governments had grown impatient. Sankara rejected their loans, challenged their authority, and exposed their leverage. They needed a leader who would cooperate. Sankara would never be that man. Pressure tightened. Trade slowed. Allies withdrew. Burkina Faso's internal elite seized the moment to blame Sankara for every discomfort they could no longer hide behind privilege. Still, Sankara pushed harder. Salaries were cut. Privileges dismantled. Corruption confronted openly. He believed the revolution was fragile, but alive, and he refused to slow down. One evening, intelligence reports reached his desk. They warned of a coup being discussed inside military circles. Sankara read them quietly. When he looked up, the room was silent. Officers waited for fear, for anger, for retaliation. Sankara folded the papers and said softly, "The revolution owes us nothing. We owe everything to it." He refused extra protection. He refused to see his comrades as enemies. He refused to fear death. And in that refusal, the conspirators understood something essential. Thomas Sankara would not defend himself against them. Not because he couldn't, but because he wouldn't. Weeks later, he spoke to youth volunteers. His voice was steady, but shadows lived behind his eyes. While revolutionaries as individuals can be murdered, he told them, you cannot kill ideas. Some cheered. Some cried. Hidden among the crowd were men paid to observe him, to measure his strength, his resolve, his vulnerability. The plot tightened. Compaoré withdrew from public life. He avoided joint appearances. He skipped meetings. When he did attend, he arrived late and left early, eyes never meeting Sankara's. One night, Sankara went to see him privately. No escort. No guards. Just lantern light and quiet streets. A maid answered the door, nervous, explaining that Blaise was not available. Sankara nodded and walked back into the night alone. Inside Compaoré's circle, the final decision was made. The National Council meeting, weekly, predictable, unguarded. Sankara always arrived unarmed. Trust was the only security. They chose that moment. Days before the meeting, Sankara confided in a friend, "If death comes, it will not surprise me. But I will not run from it." As the city slept, soldiers loyal to Compaoré repositioned themselves across Ouagadougou. Trucks moved under the cover of routine drills. Radios tuned to coded frequencies. And just before sunrise, the final order was given. The men who once saluted Sankara prepared to kill him. The brothers who marched beside him prepared to erase him. The revolution was about to be drowned in blood. On the morning of October 15, 1987, the sun rose quietly over Ouagadougou. The city looked peaceful, unaware that history was about to shatter. Thomas Sankara woke early, dressed simply in his fatigues, tied his boots and stepped outside. The air felt still, unnaturally still. He rode to the National Council meeting on his motorbike. No official car. No armed guards. Leadership to him was not a throne, it was honesty. As he approached the building, soldiers stood nearby. Not his loyalists, the men sent to kill him. Sankara nodded politely as he passed them. Inside, ministers gathered around a wooden table. Papers rustled. Chairs creaked. Sankara entered smiling, greeting each man warmly. Outside, engines roared. Armored vehicles surrounded the building. The sound reached the room. Boots. Metal. Radios. Sankara stood. He did not panic. He breathed out slowly, as if greeting something he had already accepted. Gunfire erupted. Windows shattered as soldiers stormed in. Sankara raised his hands and said calmly, "If it is me you want, here I am." He stepped forward, shielding the others. He did not beg. He did not run. The bullets struck him, again and again. Witnesses said he seemed suspended in that moment, as if what he represented refused to fall. When he collapsed, 12 of his closest companions were murdered alongside him. His body was dragged away, buried in secret. His guitars, diaries, and photographs were confiscated. His name banned. His speeches erased from airwaves. Blaise Compaoré announced a tragic accident. He promised stability, cooperation, but they could not bury Thomas Sankara. Across Burkina Faso, grief spread like fire. Markets closed. Candles burned. Children wrote his name in the dirt. Elders whispered, "A spirit like that does not die." And something unexpected happened. Instead of fading, Sankara grew. His speeches circulated in secret. His ideas spread to universities, unions, artists, and youth movements across Africa. Leaders who once dismissed him now quoted him. Years later, when the people finally rose against Comparé's dictatorship, they marched with Sankara's portrait held high. When Compaoré fled in 2014, it was Sankara's spirit that led the uprising. His body was exhumed. His killers were named. Justice, delayed, began to breathe. Today, Thomas Sankara is not remembered as a fallen leader. He is remembered as a moral compass, a reminder that power does not have to corrupt, that leadership can be humble, that integrity can survive death. He once said, "You cannot carry out fundamental change without a certain amount of madness." He lived those words. He died for them. And the revolution he began did not die with him. If you want more untold stories history tried to erase, follow Hidden Tales.